Hello, my name is David Bernstein. I am the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. JILV supports the free expression of ideas inside and outside the Jewish community and opposes cancel culture and the imposition of critical social justice. We are extremely concerned about the rise of ideology-inspired anti-Semitism and are working to educate the Jewish community and the general public on how these novel forms of anti-Semitism manifest themselves and what we can do about them. We are very pleased to sponsor this Rabbis Forum on the free expression of ideas with our partners at the Speech Project of the Jewish Journal. Rabbis are not just spiritual leaders, they are change makers in the Jewish community. We need their voices and their guidance during these highly polarized times, and we need them to help us navigate them. So we're really happy to have some of the very best today, some of those who have inspired me personally. This live stream kicks off the JILV Rabbinic Council, which will be chaired by Rabbi David Wolpe. If you are a rabbi or you know a rabbi who might be interested in this, please let us know. This will be a great opportunity to organize rabbis for the cause of free expression. You can let us know by emailing info@jilv.org. I'm now pleased to turn the program over to Monica Osborne, who is the newly appointed executive editor of the Jewish Journal and the curator of the Speech Project. And she also happens to be a scholar in residence for the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Thank you so much, Monica, for moderating today.
Thanks, David. I'm happy to be here. I'm honored to moderate such a timely discussion with four important rabbinic voices. I suspect that anyone watching today understands just how important dialogue and the idea of freedom of expression are in the Jewish tradition and in our community. Our sacred texts reflect this ideal time and time again. From the Torah to the Talmud to the Midrashim, we find multiple and often competing interpretations of the text, as well as disagreements that are not always resolved. And this is not an error or a regret, rather it's the beauty of Judaism and Jewish thought. Today we have four rabbis who will likely both agree and disagree in their responses to the questions we've prepared. And so at this point, I'd like to introduce each of our four speakers, and then we will get started with the first question. Rabbi David Wolpe, named one of the 500 most influential people in Los Angeles in 2016 and again in 2017, most influential rabbi in America by Newsweek, and one of the 50 most influential Jews in the world by the Jerusalem Post, David Wolpe is the Max Webb Senior Rabbi of Sinai Temple. Rabbi Wolpe previously taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York, the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, Hunter College, and UCLA. Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamb, founder of the Joshua Network. Rabbi Lamb is one of the youngest leaders of a major Jewish organization in the US, serving as chief executive of B'nai Zion, which has supported educational and humanitarian projects in the United States and Israel for over 112 years. Rabbi Lamb is a Princeton-trained historian of religion. Rabbi Jeffrey Salkin, author of numerous books on Jewish spirituality and ethics, Rabbi Salkin is winner of the 1993 Benjamin Franklin Award for the best religion book published in the United States. He serves as the spiritual leader of Temple Israel in West Palm Beach, Florida. And finally, we have Rabbi Serena Eisenberg, director of the Northern California American Jewish Committee since February 2018. Rabbi Eisenberg had previously spent 10 years as executive director of Hillels at Stanford University and Brown University. She was a Wexner Graduate Fellow while obtaining ordination at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. All right, so without further ado, I'm just going to begin with the first question that I have, and it's, what does Judaism have to say about open discourse, free expression, and debate? And I would like to start with Rabbi Wolpe for this one.
So the flattering answer, first of all, thank you, Monica, and thank you, David, for this, and thank you my colleagues for joining us in this forum. The flattering answer, of course, is that Judaism is always open to debate and you can say anything and the Talmud records opposing opinions and all of that is true. We should be aware of the fact that Judaism also has, for example, anti-blasphemy laws. And it's not as though there was never a history in Judaism of you're not supposed to say that. And so we understand from our own internal struggles what it is to be able to have free expression and also what it is to regulate free expression. But I think that I suspect that all my colleagues will agree, at least with this, the overwhelming burden of the Jewish tradition is that almost anything that is said with any attempt, as opposed to just to insult or berate, any attempt to seek truth, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's extreme or moderate, ought to be listened to and weighed, understood and reacted to, as the famous phrase has it from the Talmud, both this and that, that is both sides of the arguments, are words of the living God.
I'd like to go to Rabbi Eisenberg next.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on this panel. And hello, Monica. Hello, David. And hello to the listeners. There are so many examples of Judaism supporting open discourse and free expression and debate. One wonderful example is the Passover Seder, which is the most celebrated Jewish ritual or tradition in America, I would say, by American Jews. And just think about it. I mean, what an exciting opportunity to challenge and ask questions and have deep critical analysis of our master narrative. I don't know of other religions that would be open to that kind of deep discourse. And equally important, another example that comes to mind, and maybe one that's often less discussed when you're talking about free speech, is the central importance of the Shema, that we truly have to be listening to the perspective of one another to hear and see one another, the divine image within the spark of holiness in each person. And that's an incredibly important core principle too, I would say, of real discourse. So those are just two examples.
Thank you. Rabbi Lamb?
So what I would say, and this might be provocative, I don't think Judaism, as I understand it, values free expression at all. And I don't think it values free debate at all, qua those things. There's no notion, at least that I'm aware of, in Jewish thought that says having debate for the sake of having healthy debate is a good thing. That may be a correct statement, and it may be one of the many things that Jews have been able to learn during our sojourn in the exile. It may be something wonderful that we've learned from John Stuart Mill or from Locke or from others. But I don't think Judaism places a premium on debate for the sake of like free expression. I just don't. I can't think of a place where you'd find that. What Judaism does value more highly than anything else is creating a wholesome and warm and genuine relationship between individual and creator, and creating a better world in the mode of in the mode that Isaiah envisioned, and sort of a world where we beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. So Judaism believes in creating better societies in this world. Now, in order to accomplish those things, I think one of the things that Judaism has sort of discovered is within that context, debate, in fact, very fierce debate, is extremely valuable towards getting us towards those things. So it's not only uncommon, it's actually quite standard to walk into like a traditional house of study and find people who are ostensibly friends screaming at each other, waving chairs around, and almost physically threatening each other in the course of debate. That is not only tolerated but encouraged, not because Judaism values free expression, but because Judaism is attempting to create a better world. And in service to that, we believe that debate is important. So what that means is that what we should be striving for, what allows us to maintain that culture of debate and contention, is the fact that we all buy into or at least in theory, we all should be buying into a common mission and story and vision for how the world should be. So I would say that if you're a society that wants to have and maintain and promote a culture of free debate and free speech, as we should, what you need as a prerequisite is a common story and mission and vision.
Great, thank you. And then finally to Rabbi Salkin.
Thank you so much, and what a joy it is to be present on this screen with my colleagues and old friends. It's a truism that Judaism believes in free expression, and I think Rabbi Lamb's caveat and boundary drawing there is very important. Sometimes I believe that we would like to say that everything is up for grabs, and I want to put a porous wall around that, because I know that we're speaking now in the shadow of the fast of Tammuz, which demarcates the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem. I believe that we have breached the walls of civility in our society quite a long time ago. My master image, of course, is the Mikrot Gedolot, the Rabbinic Bible, in which you have the text in the middle of the page, and you've got the commentators dancing the hora in the margins, people who would have disagreed with each other had they even lived in the same time and place. I must balance this idea of a free market of ideas with, I think, another important mitzvah in our tradition, and that is the mitzvah of civility. Words. That words create worlds, that, yes, tochacha, reproof and critique is very important. And so for me, the right-wing boundary of this conversation will be, yes, I believe in the free expression of ideas, and I believe that we should submit ideas to sociological, theological, anthropological critique. But unlike some of the activists on my right flank, I don't believe it's a great spot for us to throw words out that are hurtful, painful, scurrilous. I believe in a prophetic critique of society, but I'm also reminded of what Frederick Buechner once said, which is that there's no evidence whatsoever of a prophet being invited back a second time for dinner. We have to be careful of what we say, and that is why I walk very carefully into this garden of discourse.
Thank you, Rabbi Lamb. Did anybody want to respond to that before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think that maybe to some extent when we talk about the boundaries on Jewish discourse, we might be misunderstanding the purpose of free expression. I don't think that the Western idea is that we should have free expression because expression in and of itself is the end goal. The purpose of free expression was to create a certain kind of society and to air the ideas so that in the marketplace of ideas, presumably the better ideas would prevail, if not at first, then eventually. And so in that sense, I think the Jewish idea of free expression is very similar. The ends may be somewhat different, right? The purpose of the Jewish tradition was not ultimately to create a representative democracy, but the idea behind it, which is expression is intended to serve something, but since you never know in advance what the end result of the discussion will be, if so, you wouldn't need a discussion, you have to let the discussion be unfettered so that you can get there. And that's, I think, the crux of what this organization is about, is it is pushing back against people who have already decided what the end of the discussion ought to be. And therefore, people who disagree with that end of the discussion don't really have anything to say and ought not to be able to say it because we already know in advance that they're wrong, so they should just shut up. And I think that that's really, that's where all of our comments sort of find common ground.
If I could I'd love to jump in if that's all right. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I would sort of add what if I can, what I think is the challenge that we've run up against as a society, which is that, Tocqueville observed that America was sort of unique in that it had this sort of helter-skelter commitment to dynamism and debate and dialogue, and Americans were sort of unusually impudent in ways that turned off even the most raucous Englishmen. And at the same time, Americans were sort of extraordinarily religious. And Tocqueville just sort of assumed, and not just assumed, he straightforwardly suggested that Americans had just sort of solved the tension between democracy and religion. I think what actually happened is that Tocqueville was wrong, and Americans did what Americans are still very good at, which is we ignored the tension between democracy and religion. We're very good at ignoring things. And what that allowed us to do is precisely what Rabbi Wolpe just described, which is we created this procedure, call it liberalism for lack of a better term, but this sort of wonderful culture of liberal values and free speech. We created this culture that allowed us to say we're going to be epistemologically very humble, and we're going to allow as many views as we can into the public square in the hopes that each one will prevail. Now, the only way you can do that, which Tocqueville was observing without even realizing it, the way that you can do that is by making sure that at the end of the day, everybody really does have something that ties them together. The more you have sort of an Ur story that ties you together, the more dissent and debate you can tolerate in public. Now, what that means is that for many centuries, sort of Americans were, to put it ungenerously, sort of mooching off of the spiritual vitality and communal strength of biblical religion. And it was that sort of scaffolding that allowed liberalism as such, in the best possible way, to flourish. The challenge we have now is that sort of for the last several decades, many very smart Americans and many in positions of power convinced themselves, for a variety of reasons, some good, some not so good, that they didn't really need biblical religion, or they could do without it, or they had outgrown it, or they had outthought it. And what we find now is that not only were they wrong, but they were sort of wrong in such a catastrophic way that turned them ultimately against the only other thing that they valued, which was liberalism. And so, we're in this situation now where we can't mooch off biblical religion, but we also find that without that biblical religion, we can't have the liberalism we wanted to have anyway.
I would just also like to add that the paradigms we're talking about were established in ancient times and even in more modern times, but just in the past decades. I'm talking to you from Silicon Valley, where there's a completely new challenge to free speech with the rise of social media and the viral global extremism that's fueled. And so the limits and the parameters and the ways that we can legislate free speech perhaps need to really be challenged and changed in light of a new reality that we're facing.
Rabbi Salkin?
I think what brings us here today is much less the intellectual constructs, as fascinating as I find them, as what I think are really the clear and present dangers. I initially signed on to the JILV statement because I have a long buried early adolescent dread of being kept away from sitting with the cool kids in the cafeteria. And I have come to sense in recent years that there is a rather thin band of opinions floating around within the Jewish community, certainly among my colleagues, as to what acceptable opinions are on various social issues, including Israel. And I feel those wounds quite often from the radical left, occasionally from the radical right. That is why I've defined myself as a radical centrist. And I want to lift that up, and I want to put it on the table. That what has been frozen out, in my experience, and I think it's true probably of all of us, is that we no longer have the inability to freely engage in certain ideas. And some ideas have, in fact, been accepted now as a standard orthodoxy, a written stone text. And we need to, I think, unpack those ideas a lot more clearly for everyone's benefit.
All right, so let's move on to the next question. So next question is really a three-part question, and it's a big question. So, do you believe that free expression of ideas is being stifled in America today? In the Jewish community, is it being stifled? And finally, how is this being experienced in your congregational life or communities? And for this one, I'd like to go back to Rabbi Salkin again to begin.
Well, certainly within the Reform movement, there's long been a default setting that goes to the soft left. And there are historical and ideological reasons for this, and many of those reasons are appropriate. There had been a classically liberal place marker, which is to say a liberal democratic default setting for our movement. I'm talking about the Kennedys, I'm talking about Obama, I'm talking about President Biden, etc. But I've detected, and I've written about over the years, something that I first experienced when I was on the college campus in 1974, a not subtle shift to the more radically left. It's almost a generational shift that comes and goes from time to time. And I think that is creating a sense of alienation among a number of lay people who are members of synagogues and who are supportive of institutions. I think that what has happened is that there is a new shrillness in the dialogue. I know of absolutely no theory of human relations in which you yell at people and call them racist and bigot, and through that mechanism are actually able to convert them to your point of view. It reminds me of what Ring Lardner said. Shut up, he explained. This whole idea that you either learn or you got to go. You got to get with the program or you're going to be ostracized. Now, I'm not talking about tolerating the voices of racists and bigots. I'm talking about tolerating those who have reasonable critiques of certain leftist ideologies and critiquing that from within classic liberalism itself. It only got darker and harder and hotter for me in the last 6 weeks around the incursion in Gaza. Am I experiencing this within my own congregation? Many of my people are further to the left than I am. That's a pleasant surprise. That's new for me in my career. But I want to be fair and say that we're all trying to figure out what is the best way to struggle with the social issues that today we are confronting.
So Rabbis Wolpe, Eisenberg, and Lamb, whoever wants to chime in here, go for it.
I'll say for the easy answer is yes, of course, in my community and in the larger community, there are enormous pressures against expressing certain views. I think that the organization was originally established because there is a sort of what we might call racist creep. And by creep, I don't mean an individual. I mean, there's a creeping accusation of racism, of various kinds of phobias in reaction to expressions of different kinds. And some of it is a reasonable, some of it, as Rabbi Salkin said, is in reaction to reasonable critique. That doesn't mean, however, and we should be aware of this, that the same phenomenon doesn't exist on the right. It does exist on the right. Since I have a very politically divided community, I've seen people on both sides take great umbrage at statements on the other side. But in most of the public fora to which we are part, that is Twitter, Facebook, universities, media, I think overwhelmingly right now, what we call cancel culture is a preserve primarily of the left. So if you come out as a Zionist, I have a friend who's a woman, she's a rock and roll reporter. She came out as a Zionist. I retweeted something that she said it was the first time, and I've been on Twitter for years taking positions right and left. The first time I got hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of bot responses attacking me. And so I think that there's an unwillingness to accord the decency of a goodwill difference from you that is infecting our society. If somebody disagrees with you, it must say something negative about their moral character, and therefore they shouldn't be heard, as opposed to they may be right, they may be wrong, but the only way actually to determine this in the end is to listen, as Rabbi Eisenberg said.
I know we lost Rabbi Lamb for a minute, so I'm just going to repeat this.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you.
You good?
He was on the lamb, but he has returned.
Oh, that was
Right.
a bad joke.
Let's sacrifice the lamb.
All right, so I'd love to hear from you then, Rabbi Lamb.
Oh, now I feel sheepish. I have these coming out of a hole. I was raised by Galicianers, so I'm a punster at heart. Well, so listen, on the one hand, it's undeniable that anyone who has a Twitter feed, a Facebook feed, a cable TV, or acquaintances in real life knows that there's sort of an upswing in suppression not only of as my people who spoke before me just now noted, not only in bad speech but in just like straightforwardly good, or at least in offensive speech. But I think it's worth meditating on the root cause, and I think that's why this organization is so powerful, not only because it supports liberal values, but because it's Jewish. What Judaism brings to the American public square, and what we've always brought to the American public square through the Hebraic political tradition, and through some of the greatest American leaders, from Isaac Leeser to Rabbi Sabat Moraes, down to to Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, down to Rabbi Heschel, down to the Common Day. I mean, you name it. There's any number of leaders, men and women, that you can point to. What we've brought is a sense of story, and that's critical, because values are universal, stories are particular. Values constrain us, but stories bind us. And what we need in order to get ourselves back to the kind of society that promotes that epistemological humility that Rabbi Wolpe spoke of before is we need a story that's not an accident. At the same time, we're seeing this sort of like unprecedented suppression of free speech is not just because our digital tools for doing it are better, although that's part of it. It's not a coincidence. At the same time we're seeing this, you're also seeing just this deep and in many ways like unhealthy interest, but I get it, in identity, who we are, where do we come from, what is the American story? Is the American story good? Are we a nation conceived in liberty, or are we a nation conceived in iniquity? Who are we? Where do we come from? There's a reason people are looking for a story now, because for the last 5 or 6 decades, the American story has been kind of strip mined for parts. And what we need now is a book of Exodus. We need a book of Deuteronomy. We need a book of Kings. And we, of course, yes, we do need the Jeremiahs and the Hoseas and the Ezekiels. We need prophetic voices who can tell us where and when we've gone wrong and maybe show us the path back. But fundamentally, we need stories, not just values. And that's why the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values is such a powerful organization, because it allows us an avenue towards both of those things.
Thank you, Rabbi Lamb. I'd like to just go back to, Monica, what I understood to be your question, and respond to it in a pretty different way. And that is free speech, is speech being chilled right now? And how are we experiencing that in the Jewish community? And my answer is no and yes. So no, there's incredible new opportunities and ways that we can be expressing ourselves bravely. And I spent the morning as an advocate organizing all kinds of campaigns that reach thousands and go exponential and viral. And so we have more speech than we've ever had before if we use it wisely and powerfully.
We just lost your sound.
We can't hear you. Rabbi Eisenberg, we can't hear you.
Rabbi Eisenberg? Uh-oh. I don't know if you can hear us, but we can't hear you. We can't hear you at all. Okay. All right. Looks like we lost her for a second, but I'm sure we'll be back. If one of you would like to chat a little
I
bit.
do think that the paradox that she points out is important, which is, yes, in some ways we have
Okay, did we just lose Rabbi Wolpe?
much.
Rabbi, you want to pick it up?
There we go. So I was saying we reach more people, although glitches being an inevitable part of this, we reach more people with the push of a button than we ever could in human history. I mean, the pandemic was interesting in that sense. It was the first time that the entire world went through something that the entire world knew the entire world was going through, because everywhere all over the world we knew. And that also provides, paradoxically, the opportunities for constraint in ways that are new. And I turn it now back over to the person who, after all, is in the heart of software country. And so they should come and make sure that we can hear Rabbi Eisenberg with no glitches. Please.
I'm not sure where I got lost, but I was talking about how free speech is not chilled right now. We have more speech than ever if we're using it to organize on social media and all other kinds of ways. But I did want to say that there is a chilling of speech through this politically correct culture. And where we're seeing it, I think, intensely is among younger people on campuses, but even in work environments and other places where it's harder to stand bravely and proudly as a Zionist Jew, as a Jew who has sympathies for self-determination. And one way that we see that, AJC did a survey in 2020 before the pandemic, and the results were that 1 in 4 Jews avoid public displays of Jewish identity, and almost 1 in 3 Jews avoid certain places or situations out of concern for their safety. So this both relates to, do we feel free and able to express ourselves, and also just a rising tide of anti-Semitism in the ways that those are related. But if a core value of free speech is really just demonstrating our Jewish identity and showing up as Jews in public. And I do think there are ways that that is unfortunately being chilled right now.
Rabbi Salkin, did you have anything to add to that before we move on?
No, I think I've said what I do need to say. I think that we do have more words than we've ever had before. I certainly agree with Rabbi Eisenberg, but there is a kind of a self-inflicted silence that many of us go through. In particular, I find within traditional quarters of the left around Israel discourse. I feel it within myself, and I think that there's a large piece of the American Jewish psyche that is somewhat traumatized by all of this. I wrote recently that we inflict microaggressions on ourselves all the time, and one of the things that saddens me in the current spirit of wokeness is how infrequently others will apply that sense of wokeness to the tsuris that Jews are going through in terms of the attacks on Jews in the wake of what happened in Gaza. We seem to be on the other side of the lunchroom.
Right. Okay. So now this next question is, potentially a little bit more loaded. Some have argued that critical race theory and wokeness are fueling anti-Semitism by generating a binary of oppressed versus oppressor, and that both Jews in America and Israelis will be viewed as part of the oppressor camp. So I'm wondering if each of you can talk about whether you share that concern or whether you think it's overblown. And let's start with Rabbi Eisenberg for this one.
It's a big question, and I think first of all, the idea of critical race theory now is being described in very different ways by different people, and so it requires some unpacking. And the way that I want to talk about it is largely through our work over the past couple of years, addressing the movement to bring ethnic studies to California K through 12 education, which is now, of course, spreading across the country. So what we saw was that critical ethnic studies is a particular movement within the larger ethnic studies movement that does incorporate critical race theory. And there were very nuanced ways that anti-Semitism was and will be promulgated in the wake of this movement to bring ethnic studies to K through 12 education. And as a starting point, we have to understand that it's incredibly important to have kids in schools respect and learn about one another's ethnic diversity, their racial diversity, their religious diversity, all those different dimensions of one's identity that are so important. But unfortunately, the way that critical ethnic studies, and again, this is being fueled by the critical race theory in part as an ideology and a pedagogy within it, tends to lump all Jews, unfortunately, as white and privileged. And therefore, the Jews are not part of this curriculum. They're not part of ethnic studies. And we fought for 2 years. There were 4 drafts of this curriculum, 100,000 different comments, and different ways that we had to kind of root out both actual anti-Semitic content that was in this curriculum, and then also add elements that we're teaching about anti-Semitism, as any curriculum that's designed to counter bigotry and discrimination should include that. But just to give you one small example, after many, many months of trying to improve this curriculum and take out some of the BDS that was in there and include more lessons about Jews and anti-Semitism, another version came out, and the lesson plan that did speak about Jews asked teachers to have their students do an activity where they would compare Jews and Irish in the ways that both communities gained white racial privilege in America. So the Rayut Institute has done a wonderful job of creating, I think, some ways of understanding this as erasive anti-Semitism. It's a new manifestation in ways that Jews are somehow erased in our identities, and we are not given permission to describe our own lived experience of what anti-Semitism is. So it's a very complicated, nuanced conversation. I won't go on more, but this is being played out in the ways that ethnic studies will be taught, and critical race theory will be brought to kids across the country.
I'd like to jump on the back of that not about the California, although that, as somebody in California, that's been a constant source of conflict. But the critical race theory movement, which in part, I think, has at least a piece of it that all of us can applaud, which is it expands our sense of the range of American history, and people who didn't have voices are acquiring voices, and I think that's, I mean, I can't imagine anybody in principle objecting to that, but it has at its core an idea that I think is antithetical to the Jewish tradition and is also very dangerous, which is that somebody is essentially defined more by the group they belong to than by their own character and ideas. So that if you're in this group, your words are just. And if you're in that group, your words are unjust. And this is as toxic as it is foolish. Nivra Adam Yechidi. The Mishnah says that every human being was created singly, and that's supposed to teach you that you contain worlds within you. And you could be somebody of a completely, I mean, one of the things that has made America so remarkable is we have said when immigrants come, they can be whoever they want to be. They don't have to be whatever group they came from. They can reinvent themselves and reinvent their ideas and on and on and on. So if you want group solidarity, it can be part of who you are. And obviously the Jewish people care about that a great deal. But the notion that because you belong to this group, you are this way is nothing less than its own variety of prejudice and destructive to the possibility of the kind of society that I think America was conceived in liberty, right? And dedicated to the proposition that all can be who they want to be and are created equal. So there is at the heart of this, I think, a certain nobility, but the way that it has been expressed is both, I think, oppressive and destructive.
Go ahead, Rabbi Salkin.
I want to jump on what Rabbi Wolpe just said. And I really thank Rabbi Eisenberg for teaching me more about what's going on in California. And I have a perspective of someone who lives in the state of Florida, where we have the opposite problem. It's not only that there are elements that are anti-Jewish in critical race theory, and let me be the first to say, I'm not quite sure which version of critical race theory I'm really reacting to here. There's no standard bibliography. And it's like saying, I'm anti-Zionist. Well, are you reading Echad Ha'am? Are you reading Meir Kahana? Are you reading Herzl? Are you hanging out with the people at Zionists? But there's something also that's anti-Jewish about it. And that is that Ezekiel said, never again shall it be said that the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth be set on edge. That people are responsible for their own sins, that sins do not travel generationally. This is what we say when we deal with Germany today. When I took my son to Berlin several summers ago, he looked at me and he looked around, responsible for what happened. And I said, only those who right now are pushing the age of 95. Look around. The German guilt is not hereditary. And what has happened here is that racial guilt has become hereditary, and we need to speak out against that. On the other hand, I live in the state of Florida. And I live in a state where the governor has now said that the teaching of critical race theory will no longer be permissible in the schools. Now, here, critical race theory in Florida has become like godless communism was in the 1950s. I think we can agree that godless communism was problematic. On the other hand, so was McCarthy. It is not that the people who are opposed to the teaching of critical race theory in the state of Florida are, God bless them, intellectuals who want to struggle with the Jewish aspects of this. They just don't want this taught at all because they don't want to accept in any version of the American narrative that racism has been a problem. And so once again, I find myself like Balaam in last week's Torah portion, riding his donkey, and I'm pushed up against the wall on the left and on the right. I have severe intellectual issues with this, and I don't want it not taught in some way.
I suppose that leaves me. I have very little to add to the comments of all the distinguished rabbis in this panel. So if I can, I just sort of try to explore a different element, which is, I think, I've never read Derek Bell, which is, I gather, what critical race, is sort of the foundational text of critical race theory. I also don't think that when your average person hears critical race theory, when your average kind of like HR professional is teaching anti-racism, that they're thinking about Derek Bell anyway. So I don't know how relevant these kind of core texts are to the lived experience of people in the workplace or around their kitchen tables or what have you. So I think it's worth just talking about the dueling perspectives on what America is, which is really what this is about, right? Ultimately, that's what this is about. What is America? Is America good? That's really the question that's at stake. And I think what you have broadly are just two camps. On the one side, you have American exceptionalists of both right and left varieties, right? Sort of the American right exceptionalists are of the view that America is good fundamentally, and therefore any attack, any imputation that America is not good is an attack on America itself, and therefore America's virtue needs to be defended. Then you have left exceptionalists who sort of don't accept that America is necessarily good or good all the time, but America at least always aspires to be, has at least set itself the goal of being good, and the only question is whether or not it falls short in that process. And what I think that, and then on sort of on the other side, you have what I think people just colloquially refer to as the perspective of critical race theory, but it's sort of like the opening essay of the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones. You basically have this view that America is not good. It's not in any way good. It wasn't conceived in virtue, and it doesn't persist in virtue. And this because the real founding moment of America was a moment of sin. It wasn't a moment of triumph over tyranny. It was a moment of kidnapping people into tyranny, like 150 years earlier. What all of those perspectives, however, have in common, and here's where Judaism and Jewish thought, I think, is just absolutely essential. What all of those perspectives have in common is that they all accept, implicitly or explicitly, a contract view of American society and civilization, which is the way a contract works. It's sort of a modern form of agreement that we have outside the context of politics, which is that you stipulate what the terms of the contract are. You all agree to abide by the terms of the contract. And as long as all of the terms are in place at the very beginning and all the parties kind of agree with each other, the contract goes into force. And if at any point somebody breaches any of those terms, the whole thing is null and void. So what everybody basically agrees in this debate is that America is a contract, and either it is a contract that was entered into in a valid way and it persists in a valid way, even if it's not perfect, or it was a bad contract from the beginning, therefore it's null and void. So that's why you get a lot of American exceptionalist types, right or left, who try to shoehorn all of American virtue into 1776, which is an increasingly implausible task. And on the other hand, that's why you get the 1619 Project being satisfied with just saying 1776 wasn't perfect and therefore it's irrelevant. Because they both fundamentally agree that everything needed to be good from the beginning, and it's only a question of whether it was. Where Judaism comes in and says this is nonsense, and by the way, I have like a bag of my computer kind of conks out now. I can kind of come through on my phone. But where Judaism steps in and says contracts are inefficient forms of making agreements, and they're not good ways of binding people together. And the way that Judaism binds itself, has typically bound itself, is through a covenant. And the way covenants work, and the way they worked even outside the context of Judaism, outside the context of the Bible in the ancient world, is that they didn't involve kind of two equal parties agreeing for something. What they involved was two unequal parties, one of which imposed the agreement on the other by force. So the Pharaoh of Egypt imposed a covenant agreement on the king of Amarna, on the ruler of Amarna. God imposes a covenant on the Israelites, and the Israelites don't have a choice but to accept it. And the rabbis kind of dramatize this with God kind of holding Mount Sinai over the people and saying, either accept this agreement or I'll bury you right here. The covenants are imposed. They were always imposed in the ancient world, and they're imposed in the Bible. And America, I think, is, first of all, in that respect.
Hear me? Amazing. So again, a covenant, America is, I think, very obviously a covenant in a way. So just to take one very prominent example, Frederick Douglass's response to the colonizationists, right? The people who said, yes, of course, we'll get rid of slavery, but then ship you right back off to Africa. Frederick Douglass's powerful response to the colonizationists was, what are you talking about? I am just as bound by the values of America as you are. I didn't choose to be bound by them, but I'm here, and now I'm subject to them. You forced me to come here. But now I am just as bound by the covenant of liberty and universal human dignity as you are. It would make as little sense to ship me back to Africa as it would make to ship Abraham Lincoln back off to Africa. So, America is, first of all, straightforwardly a covenant. It may be a covenant with God, as many great sort of theologians of the American experiment have thought even until today. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was one of them, for example. But it also may just be a covenant with a set of ideas and values. So you can have sort of a secular version of the American covenant, but America is clearly a covenant. The virtue of having a covenant is that, unlike contracts, which need to have all their stipulations set and met at the time in which you enter into it, a covenant is precisely the opposite. So, for example, one of the binding elements of the covenant that God enters into with Abraham in the book of Genesis is that you shall idol worship is done at Sinai. Thou shalt have no other gods than me. And yet it takes another, from Abraham, it takes another 1,000 years. From Moses, it takes another 600 years for idolatry as idol worship, let alone the kind of idolatry that we have prevalent in our societies today, self-worship, but sort of worshiping figurines, as we find in the archaeological record. It took 600 years for that to happen. It required B-side kings like Hezekiah and Josiah that no normal person has ever heard of to get rid of idolatry. The reason is because what covenants do is covenants give you a way to say, of course we're not good now. We're sinners right now. We need to work our way to virtue. We do it first of all only by reliance on God, and second of all by reliance upon each other, and by strengthening those bonds, by experiencing stories together, by constantly renewing the covenant every time we learn something new, whether it's the Civil War, whether it's the Civil Rights Movement, whether it's the New Deal, whether it's the Reagan Revolution, whether it's the Obama presidency. I mean, we're always constantly renewing the covenant. And so what that, I think, covenantal thinking allows us to do, and this is sort of the intervention I wish and would hope that Jewish thinkers, right, left, and center, would make in the American discourse, is that we're a covenantal nation. Of course, 1776 was imperfect, and 1619 is a part of our history. Of course it is. But that's the whole point. Abraham and his ancestors were sinners. We were sinners. We were strangers in a strange land, and we're still wandering. The question is, what do we learn every single time we renew the covenant? Covenantal nations, like ancient Israel, are exceptional. It doesn't mean they were perfect from the beginning. In fact, they were very bad from the beginning, but they are still exceptional. You don't need to be tracked to be exceptional. That's the point.
I want to just jump in because I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I do want to pick up what Rabbi Lim is saying, just to note that also there is not only a difference in the origins, but there's a difference in the current condition of America. That is, people read how fair and how decent a society is today very, very differently. And it is ironic that the two great issues, public issues on the table are, this is a bad place and too many people are trying to come here. It's immigration and also the status of people here. So obviously, there is some disconnect in the view of how people see this country. I don't think anybody would argue that it's a perfect country. I think that that's clear. That goes without saying. But I think that most of us, and I suspect that everybody on this seminar would say that in the long arc of human history, it would be hard to find a place that enables more people to succeed better than America in the 21st century, and even that is as self-critical and determined to make itself better as America in the 21st century. And although that is an unfashionable view, I hope that secretly and maybe one day openly, it will be a prevalent one.
So this brings me to the final question. We only have about 5 minutes. So whoever wants to quickly jump in here can. So finally, what can rabbis and other Jewish leaders do to strengthen a culture of free speech inside and outside the Jewish community?
I'd like to jump in on that one. I appreciate the question, and asking rabbis and Jewish community leaders to handle this is one approach, but I think this is an adaptive challenge. It's much larger. It's a culture war in America, and we need everyone's help. I think we need activating all of the people listening and others to address this. And the CEO of AJC, David Harris, recently wrote a wonderful article that lists 10 ways right now that people can stand up. And I'll just name a couple of them. One of them is to hold institutions accountable. This includes diversity and equity and inclusion departments at companies, at university leadership, and staying vigilant about your local school boards. We have to protect and support environments that allow viewpoint diversity. And this sometimes will mean trainings about Judaism, anti-Semitism, so that students will not feel intimidated or bullied to express their views. They can feel proud. A second, and I'll just say this briefly, is we have to engage our friends and neighbors in this. We build fellowships, coalitions, partnerships, relationships. This is a challenge that all of us as Americans are facing, to be more respectful in learning and understanding one another's perspective. And I think as Jews, we have and will continue to lead the way in this.
Rabbi Wolpe, Rabbi Lamb, Rabbi Salkin, any final thoughts?
I'm impressed by what Rabbi Eisenberg just said. I also think that a massive challenge that we are facing right now, which is combined with the challenges of Jewish education and the diminishing hours that at least we in the non-Orthodox community have available for it to share with our young people, is a strengthening of what I would call Jewish civic education, and how to be part of a conversation, how to be part of the Elu Ve'elu, and how to know your own, not only your own truths, which sounds like your own opinions, but I am finding that we need to better and better prepare our young people for critical conversations about Israel, because many of them get to the college campus and they are absolutely clueless in how to fight back against what are really virulent strains of anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism. I don't know how we do that in the time that we have, but I know that it's necessary to create, again, I think, as Rabbi Lamb said, the notion of a shared story and a Jewish story that goes beyond the living space and even the lives of the people that we touch.
B'chavod.
All right. If we don't have any final thoughts, I'd just like to thank each one of you again, Rabbi Wolpe, Rabbi Lamb, Rabbi Eisenberg, Rabbi Salkin. Thank you so much for being part of this. And to anybody who's listening or watching, if you have an interest in any of these ideas that we've discussed today, I hope you'll reach out to the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. And thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.